Thank you, and thank you all for coming back right away after lunch. I know it was kind of a quick bite. I will be talking today about an object that I was lucky enough to do research on when I was an independent contractor at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. And this skirt was something that I was very interested in studying because of my past work during my graduate studies in the clothing worn and used by enslaved people. And I specifically will be going through and talking about all of the components of the title of my talk. And so I will talk about the altered, faded, bleeding, and surviving components of a calico skirt. This skirt really represents a story about a Black family in the United States and about the necessity of recovering family stories and the traditions of storytelling among different people. This is a story about an object that also represents the transition from enslavement to emancipation. And I used the phrase "as told by a calico skirt" because I wanted to speak to this concept of object biographies that we've been talking about a lot already today. I believe that we cannot separate bodies from objects. This is in particular when we study clothing, which interacts intimately with the body. We also can't separate the bodies, though, that saved these objects and why those bodies, those people, thought these were worth saving. So when I approach African American material culture, I use theories and scholarship of researchers who examine the archive, the material and the paper archive, from the perspectives of critical race theory and Black feminist theory. I particularly like this phrase from Marissa Fuentes in her recent publication, Reading Along the Bias Grain. Fuentes, I think this is particularly useful when we think about clothing, which has a bias grain physically, but she's talking about the bias that we bring to sources and also the bias that sources hold when we study them. In her words, she says, "Like cutting fabric along the bias to create more elasticity, reading along the bias grain expands the legibility of the sources." And she's come up with this phrase in some ways in a response to an older phrase that we often use called reading against the grain of an object, looking for the absences and reading against them. She says to read into them, and that will help you expand the source further. So I use approaches like Fuentes's that come from these ideas of slavery studies, Black feminist theory, and critical race theory, and I combine them with close reading of objects from material culture studies. The skirt that I'm talking about today became part of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2011. It's made from cotton. It's printed in a light brown with an all-over pattern of flowers. And you can see there are two solid brown bands and then a ruffled flounce at the bottom of the skirt. It's very damaged and fragile, and it's not aesthetically attractive or unique at all. Its physical condition challenges what we consider to be museum quality, but it's the story that it holds, passed down orally in the family of Janet Galloway, that testifies to the existence and survival of the Black women who wore it and the Black women who preserved it. This is, in fact, one of the most compelling and special objects that I've studied in over a decade of researching enslaved people's clothing. For most of the 20th century, the skirt resided in a trunk in Georgia, which is quite remarkable that even it is still around, having lived in Georgia for so long. Prior to this long period of storage, it was clearly well and often worn. It's very, very soft from many washings. In 1977, the skirt was taken to New Jersey by Jeanette Galloway, where it was stored until she approached the Smithsonian about whether or not they would be interested in collecting this object. Several details at the waist of the skirt show the practicalities of this garment as something that was used as a pretty everyday object, and also to the multiple bodies that wore this skirt. It was likely first made in the 1850s and then last altered in the 1870s. In part, this latter alteration was to create a flatter front and a fuller gathered back to keep with this changing silhouette styles. There's an inset pocket, which has been sewn at the proper right front, and this appears to be original to the skirt, like it was there in the 1850s. You can also see a quite large gusset that's been added in, made from a different cotton fabric that's now turned a very light blue color. And this was added to the waistband at a later point in order to make it wider. At the center back, the skirt also closes with a single button and buttonhole, and there is an old piece of string that is tied through that buttonhole, which indicates perhaps that there was an additional need to widen the waist of the skirt, and that the wearer tied the tie around the button and then tied it through the buttonhole. The gusset appears to have actually been added after the skirt was also shortened, and so you have a tuck. And it may be a little bit difficult to see in this photo, but there is a seam all the way around the circumference of the waist, and it's now just above the pocket opening. And so the skirt at some point had to be shortened overall for a different wearer. The multiple bodies of Black women represented in this skirt speak to me of Black feminist and slavery scholar Stephanie M.H. Camp's concept of the three bodies inhabited by enslaved women. So she talks about the body of domination, the body of suffering, and the body of pleasure. These are all states of being that are inhabiting one physical enslaved body, and you can't take them apart because they're all within that one person's experience of enslavement. So when we think about this theory and we think about the skirt, it was likely originally used in the 1850s by an enslaved woman, and then later by emancipated women, and probably by women who experienced both enslavement and emancipation. Camp's theory, she applies this to the bodies of enslaved people, but I think it's also relevant when we think about the transition into the emancipation period and into the late 19th century in the US South in particular, where treatment of enslaved people was continuing to be heavily policed and controlled, but Black people in the South were still continually resisting this treatment and insisting upon pleasurable lives, just as they had during enslavement. The representation of family resilience that this skirt's provenance holds tells of the goals of a pleasurable, enjoyable, fulfilling life of Black people in this country. When we think about the alterations of the skirt, I've talked about some of the physical alterations around the waist, but there's also the representation of altered lives. If there is an enslaved woman who first used this in the 1850s, then either that same woman later in life, during the 1870s, or possibly her daughter, also used and wore this skirt. So they were both likely enslaved in Georgia, experienced the American Civil War, and then emancipation and freedom. These are incredibly momentous transitions in their lives, but this skirt is also quite mundane, everyday cotton object. So it represents both that great change, but also just the day-to-day living in its simple fabric and construction. There are also some additional physical alterations to the skirt made at the bottom. So in addition to shortening it at the top with that tuck, they've also appeared to have cut along the bottom, what was originally the bottom length of the skirt, and pleated it in order to create that flounce. And so what you're seeing in this photograph is the flounce is turned up, and you're seeing the original outer part of the skirt underneath it. So they just sewed right over the top of it. And those brown bands are holding the pleats of the skirt. This would have shortened it, but also added a bit of style or character to the skirt as well. Newbold Richardson, who appraised the skirt prior to it being acquired by NMHC, argues that it was probably part of a dress originally, and that the original bodice may have been deconstructed in order to make some of the alterations to the skirt. The fading on the skirt You can see here very faint floral calico pattern, and you can really see the thinness and softness of the fabric in its current state in this photograph. Washing, wear, sunlight, and time have all faded the design that was likely much bolder. Near the solid brown panels, you can see even further damage and places where the floral pattern is totally absent now. To me, this physical fading is a reminder of the history of Black families that has been made invisible over time in our standard narratives of US history. The patterns of living are still there. They've always been there, and you don't have to look as hard as you might think in the historical record to preserve them and restore them to the narrative. The bleeding on the skirt speaks again to the physical damage here and the fugitive brown dye that has bled out onto the skirt. It probably got wet at some point when it was being stored in Georgia or New Jersey. And the iron mordant, which was confirmed by testing by the Smithsonian Museum Conservation Institute, that was used in the dye of the solid brown panel additions, has bled onto the calico of the skirt. This, though, too, speaks again to Camp's theories of the enslaved body and its experience. And the bodies of domination and suffering are a reminder in the word bleeding that we use to describe this type of damage. And then the violence applied to the bodies of the women who wore this skirt. It's then really, to me, an object that embodies these multiple states of being. It's of an individual and family survival through slavery, emancipation, freedom, through the entirety of the 20th century and now into the 21st century. Its survival is carefully documented in the archive. It passed from Janet Galloway, who the museum was contacted by the museum, through her father Wiley's maternal line. So she inherited it from her paternal grandmother, Mary Lizzie Hunt Galloway, in 1977. And when this happened, this transfer of the skirt from Mary Lizzie to Jeanette, Jeanette was living in New Jersey at the time and got a call that her grandmother was quite ill and was probably passing. So she returned to Georgia, and on a deathbed conversation about a trunk in the hallway that had contained special items and that the children were never allowed to play with or open when they were young. Her grandmother told Jeanette, go look in that trunk, and there's a sort of secret compartment underneath the top. And she pulled out the things, and she talked with her grandmother, and her grandmother said, "These things belonged to your ancestors. They were your mother's mothers, grandmothers, mothers, mothers." And she pointed, her grandmother, to each of her 5 fingers. And when Jeanette tells the story, she also points to her 5 fingers. To trace back this lineage, I needed to have a little bit more information than was initially collected from the museum when they got the skirt. And so I had a phone conversation with Jeanette Galloway in January 2017 as part of cataloging this object. In that conversation, she told me about her father, Wiley, her grandmother, Mary Lizzie Big Mama Hunt Galloway. She remembered how her grandpa, Horace, Mary Lizzie's husband, and her uncles used to make pit barbecues in the backyard, and it was the job of her and her cousins to gather sticks for the barbecue and to shell pecans for pies that Mary Lizzie made. This was while growing up in Jones County and then later in Macon, Georgia. Jeanette also told me about her great-grandmother, Horace's mother, Minnie Galloway, and then she told me about names from from the Hunt side of the family, also Minnie, Benjamin, and Florine. And these were all siblings of Mary Lizzie. So with all of this information that Jeanette had told me about, all of these names of people that she remembered from her childhood and from other family stories, I looked through digitized census records and through Ancestry. And in a single afternoon, with Jeanette's information, I was able to trace further back to the parents of Mary Lizzie Hunt Galloway. This was David Hunt and Molly Johnson Hunt. And the thing that was the most exciting to find that confirmed Molly Johnson's maiden name was a digitized copy of the marriage record of David and Molly in 1882. And I knew that this was David and Molly because they are both identified with the letters C-O-L after their names. This is an indication of the term colored, which was used for African American people at the time. These census records indicate that Molly was born in Georgia around 1862, so she was born during the Civil War, so she was enslaved as an infant and a young child during the war. My trail stopped there. I couldn't associate Molly Johnson with any people prior to that. I couldn't find the names of enslavers, white families in this area who may have had the last name Johnson and had records that survived of someone named Molly documented in those records. But I think if somebody was going to go through the local archives that perhaps were not digitized yet, that we might still be able to find evidence of Molly Johnson as an enslaved person and possibly also of her mother, who was the likely original owner of the skirt. My next step, after I found all of this exciting information, first thing I did was I called Jeanette and I said, "Thank you so much for sharing your story with me, and now I have something to share with you." And to be able to tell her a little bit more about this family that she so valued, and to help her document her ancestors, it will always be one of the most important and special moments that I've ever had as a researcher, to be able to share that information with her. I then also, though, had to think about how I would record the story of this object in our collections management database, and we used the museum system by Gallery Systems. So you're going to see some screenshots of some reports from that work. The approach to cataloging at NMHC that we took, we were always trying to think about combining the physical and the emotional stories of objects, because a lot of the things that we collected were not special or remarkable in terms of being pristine, perfect examples. They were often very well used, or they were just a sort of typical everyday thing, but the story behind it and the survival of it is what made it special. So here in this screenshot, you can see under the attributes, the subject families. This was a very important one for us, of reconstructing in the data that these things were saved by families and that family lineage survives unbroken for many, many generations in African American families. We also thought very carefully about language. The provenance section also documents that lineage of the skirt, but it's documenting the lineage of the family and the ownership of the skirt through the family at the same time. So it's documenting the story and the physical information about the object at the same time. You'll see here that we thought very carefully about the language that we use. And if you look in the latest edition of Museums in Motion, some of the folks that I was cataloging with there wrote up about what we were calling the culturally responsive database. And this meant that we cataloged based upon existing taxonomies, but when they didn't reflect inclusive language or wording that was currently being accepted, we adjusted those taxonomies in order to be more correct. And so here you see the use of the word enslaved person instead of slave, which is something that slavery scholars do in order to indicate that the act of enslavement is being done to someone is experiencing that, and that it is not their entire identity. The final thing to do was to record a brief version of the family narrative in the notes area of the database. So I have a fuller research summary that notes from my phone call that I had with Jeanette Galloway, and then copies of the archival records that I located. And these are all stored in the accession file, and you can see reference to them in the sources at the end of this notation. And that should allow future researchers who would maybe like to go and learn more about this skirt to retrace my steps and my documentation of my sources. One of the other things that we think about when we think about things that end up in museums is their value. And with this skirt, the concept of value and the valuation of enslaved people, and the recent work of Dinah Ramey Berry in The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, which looks at the various economic valuations put upon enslaved bodies from before birth until after death of those bodies. And she talks too, though, in addition to those monetary values, about soul value, which is an internal value that enslaved people placed upon themselves, often connected to faith practices and religious beliefs, about their inherent value as people, and that they were constantly aware of the monetary values being assigned to them, and they often manipulated those values, but they also insisted upon having a value that they assigned themselves. And to me, this talks again about the skirt and the value of it as an example of intangible heritage and really an invaluable thing. It's the cultural value of the skirt. It's not in its physical beauty. It's in the beauty of the bodies of the wearers and the users, and the beauty of their family history. And that history has a new chapter, a final chapter. When Jeanette Galloway was interviewed in 2016 as the museum was getting ready to open, she has this new part of the story. And she still talks about the story and describes the skirt that in a way you can tell that even though she no longer legally owns it, she still feels that this skirt is hers. It is her family's skirt. But it's also a survivor that she recognizes as representing the families of millions of Black Americans who experienced enslavement and freedom. So when she was asked in interviews how she felt about the skirt going to the museum, one of her responses was that it was a glorious tribute to my people to have such a fine, final resting place. And in another interview, she said, "This is why they saved them. This is freedom. This is the resting place." So she sees this as the chapter, the resting place of her skirt, of her ancestors, and of her people. Thank you.